into the cloud. Okay. Welcome everyone to this evening's theological writing panel discussion. We have three panelists this evening to help us understand theological writing, what it is and what it is not. And so we look forward to what we have to learn from this evening. Our panelists include Dr. Julia O'Brien, who has been the Hebrew Bible Old Testament professor at LTS since 1997. Because she regularly teaches students in their first year of seminary, she sees students in the early stages of figuring out how to write for a seminary context. She also coordinates the Christianity and the Arts course, which comes later in the curriculum. That course that calls for a different type of engagement than the biblical studies courses. Like others on our faculty, Dr. O'Brien publishes her own research as well and writing for popular and academic audiences. Over the years, she's developed lots of ways to consider her audience and to stay on track with her projects. We also have Dr. Kathy Harvey Nelson, who is our adjunct professor at LTS and coordinator of Ministerial Studies program, and Frank Gray, who served as adjunct professor and writing coach at LTS for 9 years, is a retired coordinator for secondary language arts in the School District of Lancaster, and educated 2 generations of college-bound students in IB and AP language and composition courses. Thank you, panelists, for being here. We have a series of questions to present this evening, and I will call on each of our panelists to answer specific questions. But panelists, if you have something to offer, please feel free to add to whatever you think would be helpful. So, in understanding types of writings, Dr. O'Brien, could you explain the differences between an academic theological essay versus a sermon?
Yes, and I'll go ahead and apologize. I have a cough.
Oh.
I have the new cold that everybody's getting. So excuse me if I cough. A lot of people come to seminary expecting it to be an extension of church. And there are ways in which seminary has some commonalities with church. We worship together, we have communities. But seminary is also an educational academic setting. So as a master's degree student or later as a DMin student, you're learning and trying to begin to master different disciplines, different fields of study, how they work, and how they would apply to your ministries. And so each of those contexts, the church and the seminary, has different audiences and it has different expectations that go with it. And for that reason, they each have kind of different writing styles that go with them. So think about sermons for a minute. In most religious setting, a sermon is that moment where the preacher tries to move you to feel something, to repent, to praise, to change your behavior, to lament, whatever it is. And so sermons aren't reports on commentaries you've read. I actually don't like those kind of sermons. I want somebody to speak to me in light of what they know and to move me, to engage me, to feed me spiritually. Academic writing, like in seminary, it also tries to persuade you, maybe even move the reader, but it's doing it, and here's the big difference, as a conscious conversation with what you're learning and reading in class. So what you're doing in a seminary paper is trying to show to somebody else, to explain to somebody else how you're pulling together everything that you're doing in the classroom and beyond into your own thinking, or at least your thinking for that moment. So in a seminary paper, I don't want to tell me just what your opinion is, just your opinion, because chances are, if you just give me that, I won't know that you've been in my class. I don't know that you've done anything with that. So a good rule of thumb is that if I can't tell that you attended the class before you wrote the paper, you're probably not on the right track. But on the other hand, I don't want a report of your reading, right? Because honestly, I did the reading too. So I know what's in the reading, but what I don't know is what you did was in the reading. So I tend to think in analogies. What's it like? So this is a bad analogy. One bad analogy is that you're like a lawyer in a courtroom. And what you're doing is, yeah, you're using information, you're using evidence, you're using the police reports, whatever. But what you're doing is you're talking to the jury and you're pulling it all together into a coherent picture. Or, whatever your field, other fields are, whether you're a musician or whether you're a woodworker or whatever, every field you have to master the technical skills, the how to use that tool, how to do the scales. But if you're doing it well, you're always going to do something with it that's different than what somebody else can do with it. It's always an art based in some information and some skills. So, like if you're on the Great British Baking Show, you have to have those, you have to have the technical skills, you have to know the chemistry of cooking, but you're not going to win that you're not going to win that prize if you don't do something that shows your own personality. So to me, these are some of the differences, and it's a theme I'll come back to a little bit later. Don't forget what class you're in.
Great, thank you. And I personally love the connection to the Great British Baking Show. Dr. Nelson, could you explain the differences between a reflection paper and an article one might write for a church newsletter?
Yeah. Kind of like Dr. O'Brien talked a little bit about knowing your audience and interacting with the way you interact with sources and resources. When you're writing a reflection paper, very often you're expected to be interacting with some source, whether it's you're interacting with something that you learned in a class or something that you're reading for a class, or even interacting with your own experiences that you've been asked to reflect on your experience with. I'll use my class as an example. Every time we approach a new spiritual practice, I will ask the students to reflect on their prior experiences with that spiritual practice. So what I'm not looking for is someone to say, oh yeah, I've practiced centering prayer, I really enjoy it. That's not a reflection on your engagement with centering prayer. Reflecting on your engagement with centering prayer is saying, I've engaged in centering prayer, and when I've done it, these have been my experiences. And now that I think about it, I'm pondering, and these are some questions I would raise. Or I've done further reading, and as I've read, I've come to know. So when you're doing reflecting, you're looking for digging a little bit deeper with a resource or an activity or an experience, and again, you're interacting with that. You're not just reporting back, oh yeah, I've done that, I know how to do it, check the box and move on. You're actually showing me that there's some movement with that work or with that experience. As far as a church newsletter article, that's kind of an interesting piece. In some ways, I sometimes thought of church newsletter articles as press releases to your congregation. But as I was preparing for this presentation tonight and thinking over the many things that I've done as newsletter articles in the past, I kept coming back to newsletter articles are often connecting pieces. in one way or another, they're trying to connect your community in some way, either to each other or to the worship that's happening. Like you might write a newsletter article preparing them for a sermon series that you're doing so that they can begin thinking with you as worship is going to be happening and you're heading in a certain direction with a sermon series. Or maybe you're connecting them with a growth moment or a discernment moment as a congregation, and you may use a newsletter article in that way. So I've used newsletter articles to introduce a congregation to a season of spiritual practice during Lent very often. Pastors will do that. They will use the season of Lent to move through a series or one or two spiritual practices. So newsletter articles are kind of connecting pieces. You may use them to connect the congregation to folk outside the walls, and how do we connect with others who are different from ourselves? How do we connect with missions, and how does that become ministry, and what does that look like? So in some ways they're motivational pieces, in some ways they're devotional pieces. They might or might not be deeply researched, but there has to be at least some something other than just your opinion, I believe, goes into a newsletter article. I think you need to be able to speak intelligently about what you've written. It shouldn't just be something that you say, oh yeah, the newsletter article's due today. My administrative assistant's looking for it, so I better shoot something off the hip. I think that's a really poor way to present something to your congregation, because they take those things and they learn from them or they don't. And so whether it's a theological reflection paper that you're handing in for a class, or it's a newsletter article that you're writing for a group of people that you're leading as a faith leader, I think they bear some real commitment and purpose.
Great, thank you. It's helpful. Frank, I'm wondering, what would you say is the thing that seminarians get mixed up the most when trying to discern these different types of papers and writings?
Well, there are several elements that are very, very apparent. First of all, the vast majority of us, when we write, think in our own voices and put our own voices in dialogue directly with an audience. And that is extraordinarily important. But the difference in theological writing, especially, is that you don't use the personal pronouns, the whole set of I, me kinds of things. And you are rather focusing on the topic, focusing on the issue, focusing on the concept. And that concept should have a tremendous amount of reflection and also research behind it. That those reflections and researches can be done in the library, on the databases, on a whole set of commentaries that are available online and in our library. But it is very incumbent that the whole context is shrunken to that very issue. And so that issue becomes, or that topic becomes the epitome of focus. And that focus has to be purely done in a very formal and a very intellectual and a very focused way. And that focus should not be primarily emotional. And I think that's very, very important to keep completely at the forefront of this writing. That's not that the emotion element can't come into it, but it shouldn't be the primary focus. I also, there are a couple of caveats I'd like to share on my screen, if that's possible, Jen. Present, and we'll talk about some of them. The writing, can you see my screen?
And not yet.
Aha. Well, I'll go beyond. You just won't be able to see me. I would.
Frank, just for everyone who's watching, we can send out those slides in an email following this, so that way everyone has the information.
Very good. I think the formality of the individual's voice is extraordinarily important. It has to be authentic. It has to be real world. It has to be natural to you and natural to the audience to make. After all, every audience is an individual. Every audience is in dialogue with you as the writer. So that voice, if it has even the slightest bit of inauthenticity, it immediately sticks out. I could tell almost by the third or fourth line whether or not it is a paraphrase of someone else other than you. The individual writing the theological materials should avoid narratives and puns and humorous asides and anecdotes and sarcasm and all of that. And limit the amount of cliches and colloquial language and informal expressions that one would normally use in an informal setting with a friend or somebody that you are, have a connection to that is more informal. All of the writing should be zeroed in on a pretty serious, but not hammeringly serious, deadly serious, omniscient point of view. It should be scholarly in that you have uncovered information, insight, analyses, and bring them to bear toward a conclusion and not a summary. Okay. Also, the theological writing should also always rely on logical discourse, conceding that there are multiple viewpoints and even some real idiosyncratic exceptions or counter arguments to the point. And I think it's very, very important for all of theological writing to bear in mind that this is the sum total at that very moment, the sum total of your thought at that very moment. There may be some doubt, there may be some exceptions, there may be some haziness in certain areas, and in my experience with the professors at LTS, it's best to admit those. It's best to address those. It's best to grapple with the possible explanations and interpretations of those. And then to also be honest and say, the mind is not made up on this topic. So just in summary there, it's you are making explicit use of all of the resources given to you and afforded you, and your thinking is very carefully calibrated on addressing that in a full manner. Now, that's difficult in a 2-pager. So the concise and precise language and the getting straight to the point without unnecessary explanation, and to reiterate what Dr. O'Brien said. She's read it, she's thought about it, she's written about it, and you don't have to explain the context and so on. You can refer to it, but a lengthy explanation is not what's necessary. The explication of the concept, an explication of an investigation of the insight regarding that is. It's good
Great.
to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all the students. So
It's good to have all of you here. I think this was a great opening round of questions, so we can hear from each one of you and what you have to offer and what we can learn about the different writing styles. I think for the next ones, if we can try to keep our responses to about 2 minutes, that will help us get through the rest of the questions. And then we can always do a Q&A in the end if we've missed anything. So when it comes to the details of our theology papers, Dr. O'Brien, I'm wondering, how does one tailor their thesis and argument for the discipline in which they are writing?
So back to my earlier point, you got to think about what class you're in. So if you, the big image that I use is panning out and zooming in. So every assignment that your professor is giving you, they've thought about it as part of a larger learning goal within the class. And if you'll look at a syllabus, you have learning goals, you have ways that you're going to be assessed. And so the best thing you can always do with any assignment is to think about the class you're in. What are its learning goals? What are we doing in class? What's the kind of language that we're using in class? What's the thing that Dr. O'Brien's having me work on? Chances are your assignment's not going to be separate from what's going on in class, not if we're doing it right. So that's really important, because every academic discipline and every theological discipline thinks a little bit differently. Right? So it's easy to think like that it's just our personalities. There's always personalities involved, but there's also that different disciplines value different things. So for example, biblical studies, it's going to consider the best argument is the one that takes account of the most features of the text, right? You learn how to use certain methods of biblical studies. If your conclusion can bring each one of those together and they all kind of add up, then that's beautiful. That is just amazing. Now, sometimes you do all the work and one piece doesn't fit, but that's really interesting to talk about that too. So the whole idea is your professor is trying to see, what are you learning about this discipline? What are you learning, and what are you doing with it? Because we care about your ministerial formation. So it's not just, did you learn skills of biblical studies, but can you use skills of biblical studies to come to your own conclusion? Later, you can write a sermon about it or do a curriculum about it. We don't have to do it all at the same time, but you have to kind of come to your own mind. Before you figure out how, you have to figure out what, right? And when students say to me, I have it all in my head, but I just can't say it. I still remember a professor I had, he said, if you can't say it, you probably haven't figured it out yet. So I do weird things, like I go for a walk and talk to myself. If I can say it in a sentence, right, then I probably know what my focus is. And so the biggest thing is to keep the big picture of your course in mind and what's going on in the classroom. But then get really literal about the assignment that you're given. You don't have to do everything in every assignment. Just do what they ask you to do. Not all of my papers are research papers. There are papers I don't want you doing research. I want you doing it on your own. So be a literalist when it comes to an assignment, and don't outsmart yourself. Right? It's usually not as hard as students make it be. So think big picture, and then think, what if they told me they want? And you can do that. And it's going to be different in theology, church history, and other disciplines.
Great, thank you. Frank, back to you. How does one prepare to write their argument? And how much research do we need to do before we write?
Well, it's really incumbent to completely immerse oneself in the issue, and look at all sides of the issue, even the ones you don't necessarily agree with. Finding all of those sides takes a little bit of investigation and also a little bit of dialogue with oneself. I believe very strongly that getting stuff out of the swirl of your head and onto paper brings forth a logical communication of one's ideas. And that those are best seen by both sides of the brain, and the ability to work on those two-dimensional statements then becomes easier and more efficient. I counsel people to list all the elements that they find, that they read, and to read scholarly. I'm always surprised and a little concerned that the resources in the library, now granted, as Dr. O'Brien has just said, if it's explicitly on the assignment is explicit about one's own opinion, one's own, take on this and interpretation of this, then that's a different story. I'm talking more about a more open assignment in that you are looking at an entire issue in a certain context, in a certain historical area. I very, very strongly advise people to eliminate all the ambiguity you can. What is abundantly clear about this? What is abundantly evident? And that you can actually point to. That may be definitions, that may be use of language, it may be structure of language, it may be the voice of the speaker on in the scripture. And then look at that after all of those things are written down, all the pros and cons, all the elements of evidence and so on, to look at that and see where the main ideas lie. What is most emphatic, what is most repeated, what is most, where did it begin, where did it go, where did it end? And then begin to use those major emphatic elements to develop a point of view. Now, that point of view and so on is very important. And I counsel people to actually put an adjective on it. Is it incantatory? Is it prophetic? Is it critical? Is it or orational, rhetorical, or whatever it might be, and then begin to put an outline together, saying to yourself out loud. And I think, again, this is working both sides of your brain, because you have a multitude of voices in your head. And if you can pull out those voices and discriminate between them and define who they are, they can oftentimes be, subsumed into an outline that is that flows one point to the next point to the next point in a logical fashion. And that logical is cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. I have in one of these slides a place where you can look at problems with logic, and make sure that you can avoid the problems of logic. They're called fallacies. So we all use fallacies, and if you want to see an abundance of them, you can look at the letters to the editor in a local newspaper. But you are formal here. LTS is a formal place in terms of writing academic scholarly work. And so you want to make sure that you are able to identify and eliminate any possible fallacies in your development of the point. So thank you.
Great, thank you. This is very helpful. Dr. Nelson, as we shift gears a little bit to talk a little bit more about reflective writings, I'm wondering if you can help us figure out how we might decide what we write for reflection papers specifically, and then if you have any thoughts on how those might be different from blogs and newsletters when we have a lot of things to say to others.
Yeah, actually, what I usually do, both Dr. O'Brien and Frank kind of mentioned the process that I go through when I write for any of those things. Most of the time, as I said, with a reflection paper, you're usually interacting with either a resource or an experience, and you've sort of got a focused topic to begin with. But for blogs, newsletters, any of those kinds of writings where you may be thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, I need to write something. Now what? What do I have to say again this month? If you're writing a monthly newsletter or a weekly blog post, or whatever it is you're doing. Very often, the first thing I start with is stream of consciousness writing. Again, I do a lot of, I know that Jen, you're familiar with, and anybody who's gone through my class and David Malat's classes before me are familiar with Natalie Goldberg and her idea of stream of consciousness writing. Just put some stuff on paper. Start unloading whatever is in there, kind of clogging up the mind, and just start writing things down. Just get it out there. Some germ will bubble up, and all of a sudden you'll find yourself starting to focus in. It's sort of like when Dr. O'Brien said, she starts walking, and then there's this one thought, this focused thought that will begin to build, and you can then begin to focus, and you can continue to write about that. As Frank talked, you get that kernel, that seed, and then you begin to build on that, and you begin to reflect on that, and you begin again. For me, most of those writings, whether it's blog posts or reflection writings, they're about interaction with the way that God interacts with you, the way that you interact with the world and with other people in the world around you, the way that you interact with God, how all of those things come together, the way you may be being called to take a stand or to re-examine something. But all of that stuff, it always starts with a thesis, a statement, an experience. And then you begin to sort of, almost like jazz, you begin to riff off of that, and always allow the spirit to be at movement. I don't know if any of you are familiar with, and now the name just escaped me. It was on the tip of my tongue and it's gone. It may come back, but there's a process called color. I use it all the time. Is that not terrible? Writing in color, praying in color, praying in color. But you put a word in a block and then you just kind of doodle around it with color pencils, markers, whatever, and just let thoughts come. And then as a thought comes, you write that next thought to the side and doodle around it. I use all of those kinds of things to gather thoughts, to allow those processes to work. For me, if I'm writing, it's got to be physically writing for those thoughts to continue to germinate and flow. So hopefully that's kind of the direction you were thinking. Just little tips and tricks for doing that writing.
Yes, thank you. That actually leads well into a helpful tools question that we were going to ask about how we have these practical ideas to brainstorm and to get that process of writing flowing and allow just for the regular flow of thought. So we've had a couple of things. Dr. O'Brien has talked about walking. We've talked about praying with color. I think that would be great to explore. Maybe not here, but maybe we can add that as a resource for people to learn about. So I know for our panelists, I had a question in between this, but since we're already on this, it would be a great time to see what other ideas you might have, Dr. O'Brien, or Frank, if there's this idea of how do we get that stream of consciousness?
I think you've got to find your own way to get out of your way.
Yes.
Because there's writing anxiety and everybody has it. And so for me, one writing anxiety is getting started. And the longer I wait to get started, the more fearful I get and the harder it is to do. So if I will make myself take 10 minutes and start, if on the computer I have 2 sentences or 5 lines of ideas, it means the next time I come to it, I'm not starting from scratch. Okay, so that's one of my blocks. So anything you can do to get started. And again, if you're completely lost, go back to your syllabus, think about the class. What are we trying to accomplish? And if you can do one thing, you'll get some confidence that you can do the next thing. The other thing that I get in my way, I get stuck. So for me, I never have a thesis before I start working on a paper. That's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out, how does all of this come together? And so for me, part of that is writing, putting notes, and just dumping it all on the page. But then after a while, that stuff on that screen is just too much. And I get to the place I can't even reorganize it. I get lost in my own stuff. So again, this is me. I print it out and take a pair of scissors and some tape and sit down on the floor and put it out. Or I do this. I've been doing a big writing project. I got a big piece of paper and just started drawing it. But anything, if I can get one more step, then I'm not stuck. So even when you feel like you're not making any progress, chances are you have. And here's a really big tip that I have. If you ever can't figure out this or this, write down why you can't figure it out. There's a reason. Maybe it's because the truth is in the intersection or in the juxtaposition of those. So anything you do to get your mind in the game and don't psych yourself out is better. So use some people color, some people write, some people need to be on the computer. I've done charts. I like Excel spreadsheets. I make spreadsheets. I do anything that I can to make myself reorganize my thought, just so by the very fact of doing it, it makes me think about it again. And that's one of the problems I see. Often students start out with a thesis and then they try to prove it. Well, how do you know what your thesis is until you've done the work? And then what you're trying to do is to see how it all fits together. You're not like a TV news host that's trying to make the facts fit your thesis. You're trying to discern what thesis emerges from the work you do. And, maybe it would come a little bit later in your points, Jen, but the other thing I do is I never leave a writing project for the day or the night or whenever it is without writing myself a note. Julia, when you come back, here's the next thing you need to do. Here's where you are. I put a sticky note on it. I write it in somewhere. I worked at a journal, a magazine for a little while, and that was the best piece of advice I ever got. That never write yourself into a hole. Always leave yourself a breadcrumb trail for when you come back, because you won't remember what you've done. You think you will, but you won't. So write down, when I left, I was stuck on this problem, or I was getting ready to explain this. Write that down so you can follow yourself if you don't get back to it right away.
Great, thank you.
One of the things when you were talking about cutting your stuff apart and rearranging it, I found when I was doing my doctoral work, I found using different color index cards with different thoughts, and I would be able to then move them, and I'd use double-sided tape, and I would move them around on a big piece of paper and say, oh no, that doesn't fit there anymore. And, or sometimes it didn't fit at all and it ended up in the, but yeah, that, and the bit about at least getting some sentences down. I put a note on here for this evening. Blank pages are like brick walls. Just write something down, even if it doesn't make sense, or if later you decide that that's totally wrong or not what you're thinking. Just get something out there, get something down, write it down, so that you started. I found I tend to be a people person, so sometimes just talking with somebody about some of the stuff that I'm thinking helps me to think more about it and gives me another entrance into it again later. So
Can I,
So
go on, Jen? I'm sorry.
well, I was going to ask, am I correct in assuming that all the advice that's being given is do not procrastinate, so that way you have the time to actually do these specific activities?
Well, I'm on the Myers-Briggs, I'm a very J. So I like to do one thing at a time, but maybe you can pull that off in seminary. I wouldn't be able to. So maybe you have some blocks where maybe this afternoon you're working on that, but I need time, not just to think consciously about things, but to think unconsciously about things. Like sometimes I wake up and I know what my thesis is.
Exactly.
It hits me in the shower. It hits me when I'm walking, and whatever your spirituality is around that, I'm understanding that I'm co-processing that in the back of my brain, even when I'm not aware of it. Let that work to your advantage. Like I'm preaching a sermon in a couple of weeks. I don't have time to write it right now, but I spent 30 minutes on it 2 weeks ago so that I could start beginning to imagine it.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add one more thing. I think many of us have a judge on our shoulder, and it's way too early for that judge to be saying no. It's way too early for that judge to be rejecting an idea or a thought or a possibility. My judge has, characteristics and a voice and a personality, all his own, but I knock him off. I throw him off the side of my shoulder, and I replace that judge with a questioner. not a Socratic questioner necessarily, but a respected person who has great insight in my life, whom I trust and respect. And I put that person on my shoulder and say, well, and then we dialogue. And then, when I have my paper filled, as both Dr. Nelson and Dr. O'Brien have said, I'm off to the races, so to speak. And I speak out to the world and the universe and to the spirit, what the question is before I go to sleep. And I never wake up without a pathway, a process, or an answer. And, that is mine. So I find yours.
Thank you. I think that all these tools that each of you have been able to provide as options speak to us students who are of different learning styles. And it's evident through each of you how different methods speak to you. I would love if any of you have a picture of some of your different artwork of thinking. I think it'd be a great thing to share with students. Well,
there it is.
Okay, there we go. Great. Thank you. I think we're going to just hit pause here. We've gone through a lot of great information. I know we have a few more questions to possibly ask, but before the time gets too far gone, I was wondering if any of our seminarians who are attending had any questions that they wanted to ask specifically.
May I add the most important piece of advice that I think I can offer? Let your professors help you.
Mm-hmm.
There's, I don't know what it is about me or us or the embarrassment or the imposter syndrome. Nobody knows how to do this when they first start. We all love what we do. That's why we're here. We love working with students. And you don't have to be embarrassed. If you've asked once and it still doesn't make sense, come back and we'll talk about it some more. Students actually don't use us enough. We're available. We will make ourselves available to help you. And so, and if we're not doing a good job at that, keep bugging us about it, because that's our work. This is our ministry. That's my ministry. Help me live out my ministry by doing this kind of work.
I have to tell you, Dr. O'Brien, I tell the first year students that constantly with my classes, that you all are dedicated to seeing them succeed and you are here to help them. So they hear it from me.
And Dr. O'Brien, that's the first thing I ask. What has your professor said about this? Have you zeroed in for clarification, for an example, for a demonstration, for a paraphrase, for an example? They'll say, well, they're busy. And I said, no, you're priority one. You are priority one. And go to the source. I always say, go to the source. Your professors have written, have preached, have tread miles in these areas, and they are very, very much connected to it. And they want to know what this new generation, what this new individual, what this new wave of people is thinking about this and trying to unravel the complexity. Go to the source. So I'm sorry to know that so few do.
I appreciate you all sharing that. I imagine it might have been tougher in a virtual world to be able to do that as students. And so it's really good to be reminded in this setting that there is always space for questions. So thank you all for sharing that. I have some other technical questions that I'm open to asking if we want to continue for just a few more minutes, or we could collect the information and put it in a document for students to share, for us to share next week. Panelists, I don't want to take too much of your time, and I know that we're close to the hour point. So what would be best for all of you?
I'm okay to go a little bit more
Same here.
if that's helpful.
Okay, then let's just ask, I think we have about 2 more questions, and I think that would cover all that we have here. So one question yet in regard to tools is, what are some suggestions for recording bibliographic information as we collect our data for writing?
You have to do it. And you have to do it. It is time consuming. It is a pain in the tush. Nobody wants to do it. It's tedious. It's horrible. But the only thing worse than that is having to go back later and trying to recreate it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I know, because whenever I take a shortcut, I pay it down. So I have all kinds of things to make sure I know what my source is. And when in a document, I've cut and paste somebody else's words, or when they were my words, because sometimes I can't remember. Was that me? Boy, that really sounded smart. Or that. So I put them in a different color. I indent them. Whatever it is, I have to have a system that if it's in italics, it is not my words, right? I personally use a software program called EndNote, and it's the coolest thing ever because you can go to the Koha library.
Could you spell that for us, Dr. O'Brien?
Yes, I'll put it.
Okay.
Now you have to pay for it, so it's not for everybody, you know. But what it does is there are other programs like this. You can go onto the library website and do export,
Right.
and it'll bring all that information into a database. And then when I'm ready to do a footnote or an endnote, you know, sometimes I have to use Chicago style, sometimes I have to use APA style. I'll just say, go do APA style. But even if you're doing old school note cards or just typing it, do something that you can get back to it, whether it's a link, like do a hyperlink in your Word document. But you gotta do, I have to do something every single time, or I always pay for it.
Through the library, the Zotero system, that's really, really helpful. If you use the
Is that free? Is that free?
It's
Yes.
free to the students, yes.
Yes. I really suggest that all students set up a reference folder in which they have all sorts of links to all sorts of commentaries, archives, databases, et cetera, and have at their fingertips the ability to pull down a menu and then click on it and get going. One of the things, and I know this is framing a question that was asked in the original ones. What do I do with the CMOS, the Chicago Manual of Style, a 17th edition? OWL, the online writing lab of Purdue University, is updated regularly and is very, very useful. And in the slides I send you, I will, or that Jen sends you, I have links to do that. Put those in your reference folder and you'll be golden to do that, as Dr. O'Brien says. But a little bit of detail pays off handsomely in the long run, especially if you find yourself in a time crunch with draft 4 and it's 2 a.m. and it's due that morning at 9.
We have no idea what you're talking about,
Indeed,
Frank.
Jen, indeed. I know you, Jen.
Yes, and Dr. Nelson put in the comments here that those links and suggestions are in the MS100 guidelines on the library website, which if you don't know how, if you're listening to this or watching this later and you don't know how to do that, reach out to any of us who are here through an email or contact the librarian, because those things are available. Great. I think I have, I did have a question about grammar and how things look differently. I don't know if we want to talk about that or if it's just important to know, use it well in all of the writings in seminary. Any comments on?
Well, Word and a number of the other word processing programs will underline in a color. Run your cursor over that. It generally tells you what the spelling error is, what the grammar error is, and give a suggestion. Please do that, especially if you're sending something to a professor for comment on not necessarily a grade. It's very frustrating to find multiple things that are outlined for you that haven't been addressed. But Grammarly is a good use. Eats, comma, shoots and leaves by Lynn Truss, Truss, is an excellent handbook that takes all of the guesswork out of punctuation. On the OWL site, the Purdue site, and the CMOS, the Chicago site, there is a sample paper that is a very research-oriented and very in-depth paper, about 25 pages long, including all the endnotes, all of the bibliography, everything. But encapsulated within it are thumbnail explanations of the concepts behind it and the how-tos behind it. I find if you keep that sample paper in your reference toolbox, that if you have a question of what a cover sheet looks like, there it is. If you have, what's the formatting for a bibliography, rather than read all of that language and stuff, rules and stuff, see it in action. And I'm a very visual person. If I see it, I will figure it out. So I find that a lot of people are similar to me in that respect. So that's a very important and useful tool in your tool chest. The grammar, I wouldn't rely on your ear. Not being a native here to Lancaster County, there are certain local colloquialisms that are all our own, and we have to, break our habit of using them in writing. But generally, Grammarly or the Word document underlining will point those out to you. Let and leave and so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. So I will send a slide with all that stuff in it.
And so
Perfect.
this advice is going to sound counterintuitive, but don't try to make your writing sound smart.
No.
Just make it clear, right? You don't have to have big, long, complicated sentences. Try to communicate. Remember that's what writing is. It's trying to communicate with your reader. So yes, citation's important. Yes,
my father.
Grammar's important, all of that. But the reason that it's important is so that people know what you're talking about. So yes, it's an academic setting, but I think the smartest people I know can talk without using big words, and they can talk clearly and simply, and I know what they're talking about.
Great. Thank you. The last question that I have on my list is for you, Frank, and that is, what can the Writing Center offer to students regarding papers for seminary?
Well, quite honestly, Brian and I are a second pair of eyes, and we're a heart that listens. Now, our process is to read a paper twice. Neither of us are theologians or have a theological background. I have a psychology background, English background, and philosophy background. So that in mind, we are looking for organization. We are able to comment on that. We are able to comment on word choice and overall effects, on logic, on effectiveness as far as sentence structure, as Dr. O'Brien just said. Is it clear? Is it pure? Is it said once effectively and not 9 times using, 7 paraphrases? That kind of stuff. Is it repetitive? Is it missing the mark? We ask that you send the assignment along with the draft and give us at least a day. Most times we can get things back to you within 2 days, but because I have a more flexible schedule than Dr. O'Brien, or I'm sorry, than Dr. McDonald, I can get it back to you in a day, but Dr. McDonald, it generally takes 2 days. But remember, I tend to sleepwalk a bit and check in at 2 a.m. or whatever. And, then I'll think about it. And like I said earlier, I'll sleep on it. But we're open 24/7. We're supposed to be closed in July, but we never are. We tend to tell you the truth. If it needs this, that, or the other thing, we'll suggest, but with the complete and utter understanding that we are not going to give you a great deal of comment on content outside of the logic of it, the use of it. So we refer you constantly to your professors or to the sources, the resources, and that kind of thing. But you own the paper. I mean, the students own the paper. So yes, 2 pairs of eyes and 2 hearts, I would say, is what we have to offer.
Great.
And I hope we have a job, by the way. I hope Moravian offers us a job. We don't know that as yet. So
we as students are very grateful for what the 2 of you are able to offer us. So
wow.
We advocate for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And we do appreciate the fact that you sleepwalk, because sometimes it helps our timing.
Jen,
those are all the questions. Yeah, right. Those are all the questions that we have put together. Panelists, any closing thoughts or remarks?
It'll all be okay. Keep breathing.
Indeed. I can't think of a better place to toil in the vineyard than the seminary. And I'm
Wonderful.
very grateful for the diversity and the richness and the liveliness of the seminary and our students. I learn a great deal from you all.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. And panelists, if you'll just sit tight for 1 minute, I'm going to close the recording. And thank you to everyone who attended and everyone who will be watching this recording in the future.